Hello, welcome back to our coverage of the UN Climate Talks here in Cancun in Mexico. We're on the penultimate day of these talks now, unless they run into the Saturday. So we're going to try and give you some policy updates throughout the course of the afternoon, as well as a little bit of a take on how the media are covering these talks. So I'm delighted to welcome Rebecca Nadin from the British Council. Dr. Rebecca Nadin, you are a expert on Chinese foreign policy, as well as having written quite a few papers on communicating climate change.
Yes.
So we'll be picking your brains on both of those topics. But let's get started with the media kind of angle on climate change, because this is a big concern for the British Council, how to communicate these issues. Why is that?
And that's because communicating climate change actually is a cultural issue.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of, particularly we saw at COP15 in Copenhagen, a lot of mistrust.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that is because there's a lack of understanding about where people are actually coming from, what's motivating them, and what's concerning them. So actually how you communicate, whether it's the type of language that you're using, whether it's culturally sensitive, gender sensitive, is all really important towards getting global agreement.
Mm-hmm. And I know from having met you in Tianjin in China a few months ago that you're based over in China now. So maybe we could talk about it initially with regard to China specifically. Are there some examples where kind of the style of communication has caused problems when it comes to climate change?
Well, we've been running a project in China now for the past 4 years, working with journalists about how to report climate change. Well, more about actually the journalists know how to report, but it's more about giving them the understanding of some of the issues about climate change. Because as you know, climate change is quite complicated. You have policy, there's politics, there's economics, it's the science issues, there's the social aspects of it, the impacts. So that's quite a lot for journalists to unpick, particularly if they're not actually, say, a science correspondent, or maybe they're a policy journalist or an economic journalist, and they're asked to cover a variety of issues. So the work that we've been doing is by helping them unpick some of those issues, by putting them in touch with experts on a particular topic, and also encouraging peer-to-peer learning. We've found that some of the areas where there's lack of understanding is around some of the obvious ones, around equity, around financing, around technology transfer. So it's been really important to open up some of those discussions and give the journalists access to both Chinese experts and also UK and international experts.
And you mentioned the fact that kind of it's often a cultural issue, and I know that after Copenhagen there was quite a lot of surprise in China about the way that they were perceived to have blocked the talks, and that they were kind of seen as the bad guys by some people. Do you think that the Chinese media, kind of because of their experiences domestically and because of the restrictions on their reporting domestically, kind of look at climate change in a different way to maybe Western media? Is that something that we have to take into account when we're talking about these issues, that actually culturally people perceive climate change in different ways around the world?
Well, first of all, in China you don't really have the climate skeptic, climate believer. I hate to use the term believer because it's not actually a religion, climate change. It's a set of facts, and either you understand them or you don't. But in China you don't actually have that debate. The science of climate change is widely accepted. The focus of the government is around energy efficiency. It's around adapting to climate change. Where it is more sensitive is perhaps around the impacts of climate change and how climate change might impact China. So those areas are more difficult perhaps for journalists to report, but that doesn't mean that they don't get reported. What you will find is that different types of media in China report things in different ways. So you have some of the traditional state media, such as the People's Daily, which will very much give the government line, and you can read that newspaper to understand exactly what the government line is. That, though, also has an English language version, which will also sometimes give a different tone and a different flavour to the Chinese language version. So during COP15, we noticed in a recent piece of research that we did in partnership with Reuters Institute and Oxford University, that actually the English language People's Daily Reports was far more not anti-Western, but sort of pushing that it's the side of the argument, whereas the internal domestic media didn't go down that route because there's no real benefit to raise anti-Western sentiment within the country. You will also find that the social media platform is quite lively on this topic, and then certain economic newspapers will give a lot of coverage to the investment opportunities and the financing side of things.
It's interesting to say social media was kind of lively on the topic, because when we were in China using social media, or the platforms that we're used to using in the UK and US, like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, they were a nightmare to access because of the firewall that's imposed by the government. So, but is there kind of a vibrant kind of social media community within China which is discussing these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Facebook, Twitter, and MySpace. So yes, they are banned in China, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a social media scene out there. Actually, for every one of those, there's about 10 or 15 Chinese versions of the same. Either it be Tudo or Renren, that there is lots and lots out there. And there are different groups talking about the different issues. And there's a growing and more vibrant NGO network talking about these issues, and there's a couple of Chinese NGOs here today. So it's changing, and people do presume actually that if you don't have Facebook, then the rest of the world isn't talking, but they are.
And I know that the British Council held a side event here the other day looking at the communication of climate change more broadly. What came out of that? What was the discussion there like?
Well, that was actually a really interesting discussion. The topic was, why is communicating climate change so difficult? Because from our research that we did last year in 2009, we realised that there were quite a number of barriers actually in people understanding and receiving and processing some of the information and messages that are out there about climate change and what to do about it. Just before the presentation, actually, I did a quick survey of all the different messages that are in this building alone, and I counted there are 28 different messages, from 1.5 to stay alive, time for climate justice, 350.org, and as an average person, if you were to receive 28 different messages, that could be potentially quite confusing. What are you supposed to think? What's the answer? What's the right answer? Is there a right answer? And then in addition to all those messages about the topic, it's then, what are you supposed to do? What do you take from that? Because in a traditional communication strategy, you would think about who you're communicating to, how are you going to communicate, what are you going to communicate, and then what do you want those people to do? So for a product, say sort of Diet Coke, it's quite simple, generally targeted at women, communicated through fashion, it's about lifestyle choice, and then the outcome is that you get people to drink and buy the product. But with climate change, there seems to be lots and lots and lots of different messages out there. So are people what are they supposed to do with that? You might see messages of biomass is good, it's not good, renewables are good, they're not good. Sign the deal, don't sign the deal, switch off the light, don't switch it off, it won't make any difference. So it's really difficult for people to process that, and what tends to happen is that they end up just feeling paralysed and just do nothing.
I even see that in these talks. We're getting down to the last couple of days now, and I'm getting press briefings sent to my inbox, and I've just opened two on RED, this kind of package of policies to do with forests here, and one says there's been a lot of progress, and it's great progress and we're really optimistic, and the other one says this is a disaster, countries are furious, and they've come from organisations that are both within the building, just with different perspectives. So it's kind of a bit of a maze to pick through the policy, and then on top of that you have the various messages, even when they're trying to communicate the same thing.
Exactly, and you're also a lot about the time using English as the medium to communicate. So it's fine for native speakers of English, but actually if you're a non-native speaker and you've got to pick through all this messaging and then try and get from that an action and a clear source of a strategy for what you want to do, take that back to people. Because one of the premises for developing the journalists project in China was that if the journalists, the media don't understand the issues, then it's going to be really difficult for them to then communicate that to the general public.
But do you think that might be why there's this kind of multitude of messaging here? Because people are trying to appeal to so many different constituencies. So, for example, in the US, the economic message might be the most kind of powerful call to action at the moment. The fact that you've got jobs going to China, and China's now the leading investor in renewables and wind energy, etc. Maybe that's something that really will motivate people in the US. Whereas perhaps in kind of developing countries, maybe it's the impacts that is, the mobilizing issue. So how do we kind of find a way through all these messages? Is it that some are kind of just not worth having, or do we need to target them more specifically at different constituencies? What's the way forward?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it's quite a difficult question to answer. I think perhaps trying to target across a wide range sometimes isn't that effective. But the problem again with climate change is that it is so cross-cutting. It affects all different aspects of society. The problem is that some of the messages that we're trying to communicate about climate change are ones that people don't necessarily want to hear, because it's challenging some very fundamental issues. We did another piece of research last year looking at all the different barriers, and we identified a number of cognitive, normative, as well as the political and economic barriers that exist towards getting a global solution on climate change. And an interesting one is around ontological security. So human beings really find it most comforting to focus on continuity. So your ontological security is how you are reassured by things in your life being continuous, and something like climate change really potentially threatens that continuity. So you're asking people to think about something that is not just going to require a small sacrifice, such as donating $5 to alleviate poverty in Africa, for example, or to cancer research, all really, really important and worthy causes. But you're asking them with climate change to potentially think about lifestyle change.
Can we flip the framing though and say, hang on, in terms of keeping things how they are and having some sense of continuity, the change that we're making to the planet is anything but conservative in that sense. It's anything but kind of maintaining the status quo. This is the biggest transformation that our planet has ever kind of had made to it by a kind of species. And so is there... What framing can we use to try and kind of break down these barriers? What's the way forward?
Well, there I think this is where culturally specific and culturally sensitive framing really comes into it. So if you're talking to leaders and members of the public from developing countries, we did a bit of research here actually and showed them this barriers diagram, and one of them on the barriers diagram is the hierarchy of needs, is the poverty issue. So that is the thing that those individuals go to first. That's their major concern. Same in China actually, much more concerned about what's happening domestically. It's much easier to talk to people about things that are happening in their own locality. And China being so big, what's affecting people in Guangzhou or Guangdong province isn't necessarily the same as up north. And trying to warn people in Beijing and that part of China where there's lack of water about flooding isn't going to have the same resonance. So I think you have to develop really quite clever and clear cultural and local communications strategies.
And to what extent do you think we need to work within kind of people's existing frames and existing value set? Because I know that there's some research going on in the UK at the moment, led by WWF and other NGOs, looking at the potential for actually really engaging at a deeper level with people's identities and people's values, and tackling patterns of consumption at their root, and there's lots of research going on about growth and economic growth, and we've heard David Cameron come out now and say, let's kind of measure happiness, which from a Conservative government maybe would have raised some eyebrows a few years ago. But it seems that these ideas are becoming more mainstream, and that people are starting to look at kind of what's important to us. And is there the potential for people to communicate kind of with a deeper intention in mind, do you think, to try and actually engage and shift values, or do we need to frame things to people's existing interests?
I think personally, I think the value argument and the paradigm shift around that is really important. I think that we've followed, and this is sort of speaking personally, we have followed a very materialistic, high growth, whatever the cost model. And whether that brings happiness, contentment to members of society, I think not necessarily so. And I think climate change and the green revolution maybe is a way of addressing some of that. And I know that in the UK and other parts of Europe, actually you are getting more and more people on board with a more sustainable lifestyle, because they see it also as a way to frame their values as a moral structure, particularly in the UK and Europe, where religion or traditional religion is playing less of a role as it might have done in the past, that actually this becomes a set of values and a framework through which to live your life.
But when we've had such a kind of an unsustainable framework of life and such an unsustainable existence, and our models of development are utterly unsustainable in the West and in the US and Australia and in Europe. Do you see China adopting those, or do you see China kind of forging a new path? Like, we've been talking about how we might communicate new models of kind of a sustainable living. Is there a chance that actually these kind of booming new economies might kind of forge ahead and lead the way with those, or actually do you think they're kind of adopting the existing kind of unsustainable development models that we have?
I think in China actually it's a mixture of both. I mean, it is, the size of it should not be underestimated. I mean, we all know that it's got 1.3 billion people, and not all of those people are experiencing the new economic boom in China. There is still a great deal of people who are living in pretty poor conditions, and the gap between the wealthy and the poor is increasing. I think that China knows that it has to keep growth going, but it is increasingly aware of some of the problems of the policy of growth now, clean up the environment after. I think it's aware that that's having impacts on health, resources for sure. It knows that some of the resources that it has are not sustainable, they're not replenishable. And it's also, I think, sees that there is a lot of economic opportunity to develop green technology. I think China has or is one of the world's biggest producers of solar panels and wind turbines, and it's investing quite a lot in that area. High manufacturing, high tech growth.
So just kind of to wrap up then, what kind of models of communication will the British Council be adopting on climate change? Because you've done this research now, and I know that you're working in lots of different countries around the world, and you're based in China. Are you going to have to kind of adjust your communication for different cultural places, or is there a strategy that you'll be putting in place?
Well, for us at the Council, I mean, our job is not to raise awareness about climate change. Our job actually is to help cultures talk to each other about some of the issues. So I think what we would like to do is help to try and facilitate some of those networks. We have here with us at Cancun 17 of our climate champions from 17 different countries. Totally we have about 35,000 climate champions around the world. We have a communications program in China where we've trained over 2,000 journalists, and that work's also been expanded into Africa as well. And it's all about developing cultural understanding, it's all about sharing local experiences, it's about peer-to-peer networking and just developing the environment and framework where you can talk about some of the issues in an environment of trust and mutuality.
Maybe encourage some of the empathy that we'll need if we're going to tackle this problem as well. Rebecca, thanks very much for joining me. It's been really interesting talking to you. We're going to go back to the plenary hall for some live coverage of what's going on there, and I'll be back with you shortly for a news update.